A Noctua D15 in a sub 20 liter case seems diametrically opposed. Such a tall and wide air cooler requires a significant amount of vertical and lateral clearance, and such dimensions usually don't lend themselves well to small form factor environments. That is, until this guy showed up. Welcome to Machines and More. This is a new case we're looking at today, the Sliger S620. For a lot of SFF enthusiasts, the 163mm clearance number, which allows for a big air cooler, like a Noctua D15 or a Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4, is especially mouth-watering. And ever since Sliger was readying this case a few months ago for production, I was very eager to review it. A big thanks to Sliger for providing the Slate Gray review case today, and to Noctua for providing some of the case fans and the D15 cooler for review. I'll give a brief rundown on the specs and dimensions, and then I'll build it all up. I'm going to build it first with a Noctua U12A so that I can get a side-by-side comparison with the Cooler Master NR200, and then we'll see if the way the D15 is implemented in this case can outdo the U12A, since there is a limitation with one of the D15's rear fans. I'm guessing there's not going to be a huge difference on a noise normalized basis, but let's take a look anyway and see. So sit back, relax, grab a coffee, and let's pop the panels open here to see what we've got. Sliger is a US-based boutique case manufacturer, and this is one of their latest designs. This S620 is reminiscent of Sliger's mini-itx Cerberus case, but it is smaller, and the different layout allows for some serious air cooler flexibility. It measures in at 344mm in length, 186mm in width, and 256mm in height without the feet, which means the volume comes in well under 20 liters at 16.4 liters. Now, compared to the NR200, the S620 is a millimeter wider, about 21mm lower with the legs, and about 30mm shorter in length. Unpacking all the small parts took a while since everything was very meticulously packed and wrapped up. All the little parts are clearly labeled as well. The first thing you see when you pop up the side panel is a side radiator and a fan panel. This will take up to 220mm or 140mm fans and a 240 or 280 radiator. At the back you can fit a full 120mm fan, and there's even two painted to match plugs that can be removed if you want to run an external pump res unit like the Iceman DDC. At the bottom you can have up to 240mm fans. You only have about 70mm of clearance under the top of the PCIe slot, so ideally you're building with a 2 or 2.5 slot card if you want to have fans. All the panels are toolless. The top, the side, the bottom, and the front all pop off and are held in via metal studs. Users get a choice of two PSU mounting methods. SFX-L is technically possible to fit in the higher position, but SFX gives the user the most flexibility in terms of spacing. One is a half cage, which is designed to mount up next to the motherboard with the SFX unit flat against the side panel. The half cage technically allows for a 2.5-inch SSD drive or thinner HDD to be mounted on either side of it, but I found that the front I/O cable would potentially interfere with one of the front side drives. The other PSU mounting method uses a metal plate which places the PSU with the fan facing the front, or you can also turn around to face the rear of the case. If you're using a 240mm or 280mm radiator on the side panel, this just won't work, since you won't even be able to fit a fan on that side panel over the PSU. For air coolers, this is a pretty unique setup since it doesn't place the unit flush against the front. Instead, it leaves space for a front fan, and it also leaves space for an interior side fan. With this plate, there's also holes cut out to mount two 2.5-inch SSDs, but this is directly in competition with a side fan for space and for airflow. I'd recommend either going with a fan or going with SSDs in this space. Now, you can also rotate the whole plate around and then run the SSDs on the outside, but then the PSU does get too close for a fan on the inside. This front panel is sort of a false front, and it has a large unimpeded set of ventilation holes cut out on both sides, and that is what allows a 120mm fan to work there. The last fan you can fit is at the top if you go with the handle kit, which Sliger was kind enough to option out for us to test. In terms of the front I/O, you have a power button. It also lights up to give you a status and 2 USB 3.0 ports, so pretty slim on that front. The power cable routing is very different than many SFF cases since it routes from the top of the PSU area across the width of the case and then down to the bottom right of the rear panel. So it's going to be a little tricky to hide that cable, but I will try my best to run it in a clean way. Now for the build, I'm going to reasonably max out the fan potential of this case, but I will hold back on using the side panel because I want to use the PSU in the so-called widthwise position to get that interior side fan and the front fan. With all the panels popped off, this SFF case is a joy to build in. I'm going to lay out the fans first with the power supply, then pop the motherboard and CPU in place. I will be going with 2 bottom Noctua NFA12s as intake, 2 NFA12s exhausting on the front end in the interior side beneath the PSU. And I'm going to first set up the U12A as a rear intake with one of the fans directly on the rear panel so I get that direct ambient air intake. And finally at the top, I'll mount a simple slim fan on the side of the Kaze Flex. Set up this way, I have very, very high hopes for the cooling performance in this case. For the build, I'm installing the same 3700X I used in the NR200 versus NR200P comparison, and I will also use the same 3070 Founders Edition card. That way we get an apples to apples comparison for thermals between these two cases. With the cables and initial layout complete, let's take a moment to validate 2 major component clearances. The first is the GPU length. Now I measured 327 millimeters all the way to the inside wall, but you obviously want to leave a little bit of space. Otherwise, I don't see how you could even get a card in. Sliger says 323 millimeters, and I'd be inclined to think that is definitely the maximum. And 163 millimeters is indeed the max height measured from the top of the Ryzen 7 IHS and the inside of the side panel. A few quick build notes at this point. You will have to install the power cable first before mounting the PSU plate, since that cable has to go through and attach to the PSU first. The back of the motherboard is left open, so it is very easy to access the AM4 backplate if needed, and also add or remove an NVMe M.2 SSD later on. For RAM, I'm going to go with a set of Crucial Ballistics 3600 megahertz 16 gigabyte RAM, and the Gigabyte B550 Aorus ITX board is going to house the Ryzen 7, and on top we'll go with both the D15 and the U12A. Alright, so all done here. This was a really fun build. Just the right amount of challenge, but I think it looks really good once all put together. The top fan is a really tight fit with the U12A, but it does work. Some more build notes here. I had a little bit of a dilemma here with the PSU orientation, since if I rotated it fan facing the heatsink, then it would be taking in CPU exhaust. If it faces the front, the case fan in exhaust is taking some air away from the fan. I ended up keeping the fan facing the front since my take is less cool air is better than a lot of hot air. Another thing I had to adjust for was, since the top fan clip is inaccessible, you have to clip the top on first and then screw on the heatsink, then finish clipping on the rest of the fan, at least for the U12A. At 16 liters, fitting all these components in there is tight, especially with the limited clearance at the top, but at the end of the day, it all fits inside. As with all tight SFF builds, you have to plan out your cables carefully and even hook up some fans beforehand just to make things easy. So let's get some benchmark data, shall we? Since we also have the optional acrylic panel to test, I also ran some benchmarks with that. The NR200 is going to be the most similar case to test. Even though it is taller and larger than the S620, it features a similar airflow design and case layout. The main difference, of course, being that the S620 can only have that slim fan at the top, and the front and side exhausts as the substitute for the big top fans in the NR200. If you'd like to see how the NR200 was set up, I'd recommend checking out the NR200 versus NR200P comparison videos. Those thermal benchmarks were done with the S620 review in mind. I matched the RPMs for the case fans and the heatsink fans to be the exact same between both case comparisons. All case fans were run at 1100 RPM with the U12A's NFA 12x25s at 1200 RPM. And those GPU fans on the 3070 were locked at 50%, so noise was virtually identical, save for the extra 15mm fan at the top of the S620. I'm doing two comparisons here for benchmarking. First is a CPU-only render in Blender, with the 3700X clocking in at 4.3 GHz on all cores at 1.25 volts. The other is a gaming scenario with an extended Red Dead Redemption 2 run at 1440p high and ultra. This will push the RTX 3070 to full utilization the entire time, and the CPU will feature in at 60% utilization. So looking at the Blender render, the NR200 with a full-size top exhaust manages to pull ahead about 2.5 degrees to the good. And the difference is fairly consistent between the two cases. The S620, equipped with the same cooler, hits equilibrium around 68.5 degrees when normalized to a 25 degree centigrade room temperature, where the NR200 hits only 66 degrees. For the S620, comparing the acrylic panel to the vented panel with the U12A, using the solid panel yields about a 4 degree penalty to the CPU, so if that matters to you, then take note. The penalty for a tempered glass panel versus the vented panel is similar in the NR200. For Red Dead 2, we see the temperature on the 3070 is better overall on the NR200, with the vented S620 coming in about the same as the glass panel configuration on the NR200. The NR200's top exhaust is very helpful for the Founders Edition Ampere cards, and the 67 degree temperature with the vented panel configuration is going to be one of the leaders in any case out there on the market, SFF or not. Still though, I'd be very happy with the 70 degree temps the S620 appears to hit equilibrium at. A quick check on CPU temps while gaming shows roughly the same positioning, with the S620's vented slightly besting the U12A with glass, and the NR200 in the vented panel configuration also puts in a very strong performance at about 50 degrees. The 3 degree penalty for using the acrylic panel with the S620 is in line with what we would expect after seeing the difference in the CPU-only render. Of course, the S620 has a trick up its sleeve in that it can take the Noctua D15. So let's go ahead and mount that up, and then let's check out the differences. There are a few caveats. With the width of the D15, you can only use one of the NFA 15s. In addition, the wider stance of the D15 means that a 25mm thick 120mm fan at the rear is no longer possible, and only a 15mm thick fan can take its place. So I'm mounting the Noctua NFA 12x15 Chromax here. The other change is that a top fan is no longer compatible since the D15 takes up too much vertical space. I also mounted up the handle here since in this configuration I'm not planning on popping off the top panel, so I can just leave the handle here to show you guys and test it out. Despite the compromises, the D15 is a huge cooler, and with all that heatsink mass, let's see what performance looks like. Since the NFA 15 fan is larger and louder at equal RPMs when compared to the Noctua NFA 12x25s, I did have to drop those speeds to about 840 RPM. Now scooting on over to the Blender benchmark, it looks like the two vented configurations are neck and neck, virtually identical. Where the D15 really shines though is with the acrylic panel, where it surprisingly comes in cooler. What I'm seeing with this cooler's dual tower design is that the acrylic panel will help guide the rear intake air through the heatsink better, since it eliminates an easy escape route in the vented panel. That way the airflow will continue on through the path of the A15 fan and then out the front and front side. For Red Dead 2, both D15 invented and solid panel penalize the GPU thermal since it no longer has that top exhaust, which is immensely helpful for this card. Lastly, CPU thermals while gaming shows a similar pattern to the CPU only scenario where the acrylic panel yields the best thermals, and the D15 in vented mode closely matches the U12A in its vented configuration. Now, just because you can run a D15 doesn't mean you have to run a D15, and I think certainly the U12A giving better GPU thermals is that's what I would lean towards. Plus, I also prefer the noise pattern of the NF-A12x25 fans over the slim fan. With the performance benchmarks complete, let's talk about the qualitative aspects of the case, and I'll give you some recommendations to wrap it all up. First off, this case does not disappoint. The aluminum side panels are thick and the steel frame is almost perfectly machined. And this thing has quality American craftsmanship written all over it. I went over it with a fine-tooth comb, and apart from a microscopic paint imperfection, there was simply nothing to speak of. Unlike the mass-manufactured case in the NR200, which often has a few misaligned panels and uneven gaps, Sliger shows why it is a high-end brand for the discerning enthusiast. I love the slate gray color here, and that's not just because it's a truly unique option compared to the rest of the current market. It just looks super sleek and almost like a stealthy spaceship. Kitted out this way with the handle and with this paint job, I think you'll easily be the center of attention at your next LAN party. Of course, assuming you got the game to match, right? Compared to many cases with a cleared side panel, this has got to be one of the best looking when the insides are visible. The painted to match frame integrates seamlessly with the clear acrylic, and even though acrylic would be my first choice for a side panel because it's a bit fragile in terms of scratch resistance, it is still very good looking. Just be careful when you clean it and wipe it off with a microfiber cloth every now and then. And remember, no rubbing alcohol. It would also be my first choice to fly with on a plane or pack up for a long trip since it won't shatter. The rubber feet at the bottom of this case are very reliable and thick and also serve as a good dampening material for the case. That the rear takes a full 120mm fan is a huge reason it worked so well with the U12A, and I really like it in that configuration. The ability to run a side panel and front fan with a unique PSU orientation is genius, and the fact that it is so close to the bigger 18 or so liter NR200 really comes down to these two fans acting as a substitute for the big top exhaust. The size is between an NCase M1 and an NR200, and sure, I think Sliger could have expanded the top a bit more to fit some full-size top fans, but then again, it wouldn't be this form factor, and I rather like this form factor. Storage options are a bit limited out of the box with a max of two 2.5-inch SSDs, but you can option on some additional brackets for even a 3.5-inch drive when you order the case. That being said, my advice is to go with a large capacity NVMe drive now that prices have come down a bit on bigger capacity M.2s, and if you're dabbling in SFF, you'll know that's one of the best investments you can ever make. I know Sliger doesn't do dust filters, but having the option when ordering would simplify things significantly, as ordering those filters aftermarket is a bit of a hassle. Anything like a simple magnetic dust cover for key intake points like the rear and the bottom would be a great inclusion. The power supply receptacle is in that odd location, but after building in the case, I don't know where else you would put it. There is a pigtail option if you don't want the socket in the way, but at the end of the day, it's something you get used to quickly and is not so intrusive after a while. For the front I/O, the power button is one of the nicest on the market with a great tactile feedback. I don't use front panel audio much, but I can definitely see some folks wanting it, so that would have been a nice inclusion. And I know that a USB-C front port would have been a really nice touch. Of course, the question is, do you want to pay for it, since that is always an added expense to the manufacturer? Which leads us to the elephant in the room, the price. There's no way around it. This is a high-end case with a high-end price tag. And at $249 to start, it's not entry level for sure. Unfortunately, fixed tooling costs for computer cases is a high barrier to entry, and small production runs means higher per unit costs. Just take the NCase M1 for example. compared to the TU150, which are both made by Lee. The TU150 features more material for a much lower cost. Smaller case runs are more expensive per unit. As a testament to American-made quality, I can tell that Sliger patiently fine-tuned the production run on these cases. And my opinion is that if you are in the market for an enthusiast level case, you are absolutely getting what you are paying for here, and you won't be disappointed. As for setup recommendations and who this is for, I can highly recommend this case for any enthusiast looking for a perfectly manufactured case to house high-end components. Certainly, if you're a first-time builder, I would recommend enlisting the help of an experienced builder for putting this together, because some of the odds and ends and the ins and outs of the cabling will be a little bit nerve-wracking for you. Whether you want to air cool or liquid cool, this case can take it and run with it. There certainly is custom cooling capability here, but my preference at the end of the day would be to build it up as a high-end air-cooled setup, given how great everything looks with the transparent panel here. As a gaming build, this is fantastic, and if you can get the handle kit, that's definitely a worthy add-on. I set it up with a rear intaking U12A in order to best mount that top fan. That way you get a good balance between GPU thermals and limit the CPU cooler from taking in GPU exhaust, and that's especially important with the 3000 series FE cards. Personally, I prefer to use the extra clearance to fit that soon-to-come heatsink cover for the U12A over mounting a larger D15, since the U12A already works so well in this case. I think that heatsink cover, when it does come, will just about fit. The case can also be inverted if you want. It's very flexible in its layout, and that is something I'm going to be testing additionally. If you want to go big air, I would personally recommend the D15S over the D15 since it already comes with a single fan. Then you can just option on an additional rear fan of your choice in that slim thickness. If you're interested in an AIO, definitely take a good look at the Asetek options that Sliger gives, since they have an option that comes with two Noctua NFA12s for $140, which would basically be like getting one of the branded Asetek units but not having to pay for the lousy stock fans. All in all, this is one of the best SFF cases I have ever built in terms of overall quality, space optimization, and performance. And although this is subjective, this case gets some serious style points for its bold looks and sleek paint. Sliger does make an even smaller S610, which I hope to get a chance to review soon as well, but I really think this size bracket is the one that perfectly blends form and function for most users. The last point I'll discuss is that having been on both sides dealing with Sliger as both a customer and reviewer, I can only give the Sliger team highest marks for their attention to the customer and for going above and beyond. It's a very unique experience knowing that the people you're ordering the case from can practically walk over to their production facility to check on something for you and change something if needed. So, well done, Sliger. This here is a fantastic feat. So I hope you enjoyed this review today. Feel free to chime in with any questions or comments. I'd love to hear what you think of this case as well. I'm leaving that full build list down below, so please consider supporting the channel by using some of those product links if you're shopping. And since there's more content to come on this case, such as the inverted configuration, I would appreciate if you would consider subscribing today. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.